A racist police officer assumes that a black woman in the park is a criminal and arrests her for no reason. Afterwards, the officer realizes that he has just arrested an FBI agent. Selena Price sat on an old bench in Riverside Park, the late afternoon sun casting a soft, golden hue across her face as it filtered through the rustling green leaves. She turned the page of her book, immersing herself in the sound of whispering trees and distant children's laughter. This park was her sanctuary, a small haven, amidst the city's relentless pace where she could momentarily escape the pressures of her job and simply breathe in silence. But today, that peace was interrupted. Across the park, Officer Todd Kessler was on patrol, his sharp eyes sweeping every corner. After more than 20 years patrolling this area, he believed he knew it better than anyone else. When his gaze landed on a black woman sitting alone on a bench, focused and serene, a vague unease stirred in him on instinct he had always trusted. A black woman, too calm, too at ease. The suspicion simmered in his mind. "Never seen her around here before," Todd muttered. He paused, watching Selena for several seconds, trying to pinpoint the source of his vague discomfort. There had been a few reports about a suspect who vaguely matched her description, still very vague, but for Todd, that was enough. Selena sensed the heavy gaze and looked up from her book. She saw Todd standing a short distance away, eyes fixed on her with a look she knew all too well. A look disguised as concern, but rooted in prejudice, a baseless suspicion born solely from her skin color. But Selena remained composed. She gently closed her book, still holding the page she'd been reading, and calmly met his gaze. Todd's fingers tightened around the baton on his hip. The way Selena looked at him, calm, unafraid, made him uneasy. "Gotta see what she's up to," he muttered, beginning to walk toward her, his steps turning rigid. He hated that calm, hated the fearless silence. It made him feel out of control. Selena watched Todd approach, her expression unreadable. She knew what was coming. She had faced situations like this more times than she could count, and she knew that her next move could determine the entire course of what happened next. She didn't want trouble, but she wouldn't let herself be cornered. "Good afternoon," Todd said as he neared, his voice polite but edged with sharp caution. "Afternoon," Selena replied, her voice steady, her gaze serene. She deliberately kept both hands clearly visible, resting on the closed book on her lap. "What brings you out here?" Todd asked, his eyes briefly scanning her face before shifting to the book, as if trying to find a reason to latch onto. "Enjoying the park," Selena replied simply. "It's a beautiful day." Todd nodded slowly, but it was clear he wasn't really listening. He was paying more attention to what she didn't say. "You live around here?" Selena gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Somewhere nearby." The vague answer didn't sit well with Todd. He shifted his stance, his posture growing more confrontational. "Let me see some ID." Selena's smile faded. This was a dangerous threshold. She knew her right sitting in a park didn't require her to show ID, but she also knew that refusing could escalate things. Still, she would not be intimidated. "Am I under arrest?" Selena asked, her tone steady, her gaze unwavering under Todd's dominating stare. Todd stiffened at the question. That calmness, that utter lack of fear made him feel like he was losing control. "You will be, if you don't cooperate," he said, his hand resting lightly on the gun at his side. Selena took a slow breath, her eyes unchanging. She could feel the situation deteriorating, but there was no turning back now. "I'm just sitting here reading a book in the park," she said, her voice low and clear. "Is there a law against that?" Todd was growing impatient. "You match the description of a suspect," he said, though he knew how weak that justification sounded. He stepped closer, his shadow stretching long over her. Selena didn't flinch. Her gaze remained locked, offering no emotional foothold. "And what exactly is that description?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp. Todd's jaw clenched. He didn't have a solid answer, but admitting that would mean losing face, losing control. "Don't play games with me," he snapped. "Show me your ID, now." For a few tense seconds their eyes locked, and the air between them grew thick with pressure. Selina knew she could push back Hood, assert her rights more forcefully, but she also understood that doing so now would only escalate the danger. She decided to yield, just for the moment. Without a word, Selina slowly reached into her coat pocket, her movements deliberate and cautious, then pulled out a small leather wallet. Todd watched every motion, his body taut as a drawn bowstring, ready to react to even the slightest wrong twitch. When Selina handed him her ID, he snatched it without a word of thanks, eyes scanning the name Selina Price. The name meant nothing to him, but it didn't matter. Todd had already made up his mind. "Stand up," he ordered, stepping back to give space. Selina sighed inwardly but complied, rising slowly, her hands visible at all times, giving him no excuse to say he felt threatened. "Turn around," Todd continued, pulling out his handcuffs. A wave of anger surged inside Selina, but she held it back. She turned, allowing him to cuff her without resistance. She could feel the stares of passers-by, that all too familiar feeling of being watched, judged, but she remained calm. She knew that letting emotions take over now would only make things worse. As Todd tightened the cuffs around her wrists, even he began to feel that something was off. A gnawing sensation in his gut told him he was making a mistake. But pride kept him from stopping. He grabbed Selina's arm and began leading her toward the nearby patrol car. Selina said nothing on the walk. Her mind had already moved to the next step. She wasn't worried for herself. She knew exactly who she was, and knew that soon Todd would too. But she couldn't deny the fatigue deep in her chest. A bone-deep weariness, the kind that comes from knowing that no matter how hard you work, no matter how much you accomplish, to some people, you're still just a black woman alone in the park, with all the assumptions that title carried. When they reached the patrol car, Todd opened the back door and gave Selina a light push into the seat. She sat down, the cold clink of the metal cuffs hitting the seat frame sending a sharp sting through her wrist. She looked out the window as the car pulled away from the park, the trees along the path blurring past the glass. And she wondered how a peaceful day could flip so quickly. The engine roared as Todd Kessler drove Selina Price to the station. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly the knuckles went pale. He couldn't shake the image of Selina's calm, fearless gaze. It unsettled him, and deep down, it made him begin to question the instinct he'd trusted for so many years. Pride wouldn't let him admit that. Selina sat silently in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her. The city passed by the window, but she wasn't paying attention to the scenery. She was calculating. She knew how the system worked, knew how quickly things could spiral if she didn't stay sharp. But she also knew her own worth and the power she carried, a power Officer Kessler had no idea existed. As they neared the station, Todd glanced at the rearview mirror, catching Selina's gaze looking back at him, calm and unreadable. "What were you really doing at the park?" he asked, his voice thick with suspicion. Selina didn't look away, her expression impossible to read. "I already told you," she replied gently. "I was reading." Todd let out a scoffing laugh. "Someone like you, reading in the park? You expect me to believe that?" Selina raised an eyebrow slightly. "Someone like me?" she repeated, her voice layered with meaning. Todd faltered, realizing he'd let something slip. But instead of retreating, doubled down. "You don't strike me as the type to spend an afternoon quietly reading," he offered, trying to justify himself. Selina didn't respond right away. She let the silence grow, the air inside the car thickening again. Then finally, she spoke cold, yet composed. "So someone like me looks like what, officer?" Todd didn't answer. He couldn't, because he knew exactly what he was implying and knew it reflected an ugly truth. But he didn't have the courage to admit it to Selina or to himself. So instead, he kept driving, the frustration mounting as her unwavering calm continued to make him feel smaller. The patrol car pulled into the lot in front of the police station, and Todd parked near the entrance. He stepped out first, then opened the back door, helping Selina out her wrists, still bound tightly by the cuffs, causing her to wince slightly in pain. On the way into the building, Todd's mind spun with thoughts. This wasn't going the way he had expected. The suspect was supposed to be scared, compliant not calm, and challenging him with every glance and word. Inside the station, the usual noise buzzed through the air officers filling out paperwork, phones ringing, keyboards clacking, conversations echoing down the halls. Todd led Selina through the main area, ignoring the curious glances from fellow officers. He didn't want to explain, at least not yet. When they reached the intake desk, Todd gestured for Selina to stand beside it. The young officer behind the desk officer, Jamal Torres, looked up, surprised to see Todd bringing handcuffed woman. "What's going on here?" Jamal asked, his eyes quickly shifting from Selina to Todd. "Caught her acting suspicious in the park," Todd replied curtly. He handed over Selina's ID, though he still had no valid reason for the arrest. Jamal glanced at the ID, then back at Selina. A flicker of recognition flashed in his eyes, but he masked it quickly, nodded, and began entering the information into the system. Selina noticed that flicker. It was subtle, but enough to tell her someone in this precinct knew who she was. "Captain Monroe is in her office," Jamal said, handing the ID back to Todd. "You'll need to take her to see the captain." Todd stiffened. Captain Adrian Monroe was known for being strict but fair always by the book, never showing favoritism. He hadn't planned on bringing her into this so soon, but now he had no choice. "All right," Todd said, tension in his voice. He gripped Selina's arm tighter and tugged gently. "Let's go." Selina walked beside him, her expression unchanged. As they neared the captain's office, she could feel Todd's uneased the nervousness he tried hard to conceal. It was the first crack in his proud facade, and Selina noted it with quiet satisfaction. Todd knocked, then opened the door when the captain's voice called from inside. The office was tidy and well organized, with a large desk at the center and bookshelves and files neatly lining the walls. Captain Adrian Monroe, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a composed demeanor, looked up from her folder as they entered. "Officer Kessler," she said, her tone neutral. "What's going on?" Todd stepped forward, bringing Selina into the room. "I apprehended her in the park, Captain. Suspicious behavior. She refused to cooperate when I asked for ID." Captain Monroe turned her gaze to Selina. For a very brief moment, something changed in her eye as a flash of recognition. Just like with Jamal, but it vanished quickly, replaced with her usual professional composure. "Is that so?" she said, her voice still even. Selina looked directly into her eyes and saw the recognition clearly. She knew Captain Monroe had realized who she was, but the captain was being careful, waiting to see how far Todd would go. "That's right," Todd continued, unaware of the silent exchange between the two women. "I brought her in for questioning." Captain Monroe nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I see. And do you have a clear reason for detaining her?" Todd hesitated. This time, the ground beneath him began to shake. "She was uncooperative, Captain," he repeated, but his voice clearly lacked conviction. Captain Monroe leaned back in her chair, studying Todd like a surgeon examining a flaw. "Officer Kessler, why don't you step outside for a moment? I'd like to speak with Miss Price alone." Todd frowned, caught off guard by the request. "But Captain—" "Step outside, Kessler." Monroe cut him off, her voice leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Todd released Selina's arm and stepped out, closing the door behind him. As soon as he was out of sight, Captain Monroe's demeanor softened slightly. "Miss Price," she said, her voice low and calm. "I apologize for this misunderstanding." Selina offered a faint smile. "No need to apologize, Captain. You're just doing your job." Monroe exhaled, her eyes flicking toward the closed door. "I know who you are, but I'd appreciate it if you kept that to yourself for now. I need to handle this delicately." "Of course, I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want things handled properly." "And they will be," Monroe assured her. "I'll speak to Kessler and handle this appropriately. But I have to ask, why didn't you just say who you were?" Selina's smile faded, replaced by a serious expression. Because that shouldn't matter, Captain. Who I am shouldn't be the reason he treats me with respect. Captain Monroe looked at her thoughtfully, then slowly nodded. You're right. Unfortunately, for some people, it does. The room fell silent for a moment. The weight of that truth hung heavily in the air. Finally, Captain Monroe stood. I'll call Officer Kessler back in. We need to bring this to a close. Selina nodded, her gaze calm as she watched the captain move. The confrontation wasn't over. But now, she held the upper hand. The truth would come out, and Todd Kessler would have to face the consequences. When Captain Monroe opened the door, Todd stepped back into the office, his face visibly guarded. He could sense something had shifted, but he didn't yet know what. He glanced quickly at Selina, who stood silently, composed, as if she had known everything all along. Miss Selina Price is not the person you're looking for, Captain Monroe said, her voice icy. Release her, now. Todd blinked, the weight of her words taking a few seconds to fully register in his mind. What? But Captain... Immediately, Monroe repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Todd hesitated for a moment, then finally reached into his pocket to retrieve the handcuff key. His hand trembled slightly as he inserted it into the lock, the feeling of having made a mistake growing more undeniable with each second. As the cuffs clicked open, Selina raised her hands and gently rubbed her wrists, her gaze fixed on Todd sharp, but not vengeful. Thank you, officer, she said calmly, though her tone carried the weight of an unspoken indictment. Todd swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. You're free to go, he mumbled, taking a step back. Selina gave a slight nod, then turned to Captain Monroe. I'll be in touch, Captain, she said softly. There's still more that needs to be said. Captain Monroe nodded in return, her eyes full of understanding. I'll look forward to that, Miss Price. With that, Selina walked out of the office, leaving Todd standing alone in the room, swallowed by a nameless sinking feeling. The confrontation was over, but the consequences had only just begun. Todd Kessler sat frozen at his desk, his body taut as a stretched wire. Ever since Captain Monroe released Selina, he hadn't been able to focus. An uneasy feeling gnawed at him, and the most troubling part was, he still didn't fully understand what had just happened. He knew he was wrong, but how wrong he couldn't yet grasp. The stillness of the precinct felt strange, now both comforting and terrifying, a space where silent thoughts rose to the surface. Suddenly, the sound of steps snapped him out of his spiral. He looked up and saw Captain Monroe approaching, her face so stern it took his breath away. Officer Kessler, in my office, now, she said, her tone offering zero compromise. Todd shot to his feet, trying to hide the worry creeping into every cell of his body. He followed her to the office, each step heavier than the last. Once inside, Captain Monroe shut the door behind them and gestured for him to sit. Todd hesitated briefly, then obeyed. The air in the room felt thick, like it carried a looming sentence. Captain Monroe sat across from him, her eyes locked on his. Officer Kessler, she began, her voice slow and razor-sharp. Do you know who Selina Price is? Todd shook his head, confusion plain on his face. No, Captain. Just a woman in the park. Monroe leaned slightly forward, her gaze drilling into him. Selina Price is not just a woman in the park. She's a senior agent of the best at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words hit like a punch. Todd's eyes widened in alarm, his brain scrambling to piece together what had just happened. FBI? He whispered. That's right, Monroe said firmly. And not just any agent, she's one of the most respected in the field. Arresting her carries serious consequences not just for you, but for this entire precinct. Todd's mind reeled. He had arrested an innocent person, a federal agent. Based on what? Nothing but bias and gut instinct. The truth began to press down on his chest like a boulder. I didn't know, Captain, Todd stammered. I didn't know who she was. That's exactly the problem, Kessler, Monroe replied, her voice still cold. Who she is shouldn't determine whether you treat her with respect. You acted on prejudice, not evidence. You can't arrest someone just because they don't look like they belong in a park. Todd wanted to argue, wanted to justify himself, but he couldn't, because he knew she was right. It was his bias that had led him here. So, what do I do now? Todd asked, his voice barely audible. Captain Monroe exhaled and leaned back in her chair. For now, you're being placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation is conducted. I've already reported this to higher-ups, and they're not pleased. There will be a formal hearing. Depending on the outcome, you may face disciplinary action, possibly termination. Todd's heart sank. Termination. The word echoed in his mind like a funeral bell. Over 20 years on the force, now on the verge of losing everything. But deep down, he knew there was no one to blame but himself. I understand, Todd said quietly, his voice almost lost. Captain Monroe looked at him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. I know this isn't easy to hear, but you have to understand your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for the community we serve. We cannot afford to have officers who let bias guide their decisions. Todd nodded, still overwhelmed. Reality was slowly drowning him, and with it came a flood of regret. He had believed he was a good cop, a defender of justice. But now, it all felt like it had crumbled, because of one decision, driven by prejudice. Captain Monroe stood, signaling that the conversation was over. You're dismissed from duty. I'll notify you when the hearing is scheduled. Todd rose as well, like a man walking out of a storm. Thank you, Captain, he murmured, then turned and walked out. As he left the station, the familiar sounds now felt distant. He made his way to his car, head blank, heart heavy. He had worn that badge for so long, he had forgotten who he was without it. And now, the thought of losing it terrified him. But beneath the fear, something unfamiliar began to steer a doubt about himself. For the first time in his life, Todd Kessler was forced to face the truth that maybe he had never been the just, righteous cop he thought he was. On the drive home, Todd Kessler couldn't shake the image of Selena Price's calm, unwavering gaze. That look had made him uneasy from the very beginning, and now he knew why. She had seen through him. She had understood what was happening, long before he did. When he finally got home, Todd sat in his car for a long while, staring blankly at the steering wheel. The events of the day replayed in his mind like a loop, each cycle making the weight of his guilt feel heavier. He didn't know what awaited him next, only that his life had veered onto a road he could never turn back from. Todd entered his house in silence, the quiet space around him feeling like a judgment on each step he took. He collapsed into a chair, his body drained. His mind was a tangled mess: fear, regret, confusion. For the first time in his career, he realized he no longer knew what to do next. The next morning, Todd Kessler stood outside the conference room, his heart pounding in his chest. The police station was unusually quiet, the air thick like it was bracing for a storm. The formal hearing was about to begin, and Todd understood. Every word he said in the next hour could determine the fate of his entire career. He glanced at his reflection in the hallway window, a man older, more tired, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He adjusted his collar, took a deep breath, and forced himself to stay calm. This was his chance to defend himself. But deep down, he wasn't even sure he had a defense anymore. The door opened. Captain Adrienne Monroe appeared, her face as cold and composed as ever. "We're ready, Officer Kessler," she said evenly. Todd nodded, swallowing hard as he stepped into the room behind her. The air inside was thick with tension. A long table sat at the center, surrounded by stern faces members of the Internal Review Board, a few senior officers, and at the far end, a woman in a black suit whom Todd recognized instantly, Selena Price. Her presence hit like a punch to the chest. Todd had hoped she wouldn't be there, that he wouldn't have to face that gaze again. But she was there, seated upright, eyes locked on him, calm but cold. That gaze made him feel small. Captain Monroe took the chair at the head of the table, and motioned for Todd to sit across from her. He tried to ignore the sweat beginning to form on his forehead. "Officer Kessler," Monroe began formally, "today's hearing is to determine the legitimacy of your actions regarding the arrest of Miss Selena Price. We will review the incident in full, how you handled the situation, and the consequences that followed. Do you understand the gravity of this matter?" "Yes, Captain," Todd replied, his voice low but steady. He glanced briefly at Selena, who was still staring at him, then quickly looked away toward Monroe. "Good," Monroe nodded. "According to your report, you detained Miss Price under suspicion of being involved in a string of thefts. Is that correct?" "Yes, Captain. I saw her in the park. She matched the suspect's description, black female, middle-aged, and her behavior seemed suspicious, so I approached her." "Specifically? What behavior?" Monroe asked, her eyes dissecting every word. Todd hesitated. This was a critical question. She was sitting alone, seemed alert, and when I asked for ID, she was evasive. "How exactly was she evasive?" Monroe pressed. "She didn't want to show ID right away," Todd explained. Even he could hear how flimsy that sounded. "I felt she was hiding something." Selena's voice rang out, calm but firm. "I was reading a book, Officer Kessler. That's not the behavior of a criminal." Todd flinched slightly but tried to stay composed, eyes still on Monroe. "I was just doing my duty, Captain. I wanted to protect the community." "And did you find any evidence that she was involved in a crime?" Monroe asked, her tone growing colder. "No, ma'am. She was completely innocent." Silence. The room froze for a few seconds. Then a member of the internal board spoke, his voice sharp. "Officer Kessler, did it ever occur to you that Miss Price might have been telling the truth? That she wasn't the suspect you were looking for?" Todd remained silent, his mind scrambling for justification. I was following protocol. We're trained to be cautious, to treat everyone as a potential threat until proven otherwise. Do you think your judgment may have been influenced by factors outside of protocol?" The board member continued, his voice cutting. Todd's throat went dry. He knew what they meant, and he knew he had no excuse. "I didn't mean to racially profile," he said softly, voice almost breaking. "I was just doing my job." Selena leaned forward, eyes never leaving him. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to judge people based on how they look." Todd met her eyes, and for the first time, he saw that gaze like a mirror reflecting himself. He wanted to argue, to blame the pressure, the circumstances, but then the truth crashed in like a wave. He had been wrong. Captain Monroe's voice broke the silence, pulling all attention back to her. "Officer Kessler, this investigation is not just about that day's incident. It's about mindset, about how an officer perceives justice and their responsibility. What we're assessing is not just a mistake, but whether you are worthy of wearing this badge at all." Todd felt a crushing pressure in his chest. This was no longer about right or wrong. It was about character. "I understand, Captain," he whispered. I didn't want." He trailed off, unable to finish. Captain Monroe softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Everyone makes mistakes, but how we face them, that's what defines us. You need to seriously consider what kind of officer you want to be." Silence fell again. Then Selena spoke, her voice low and weighty. "Captain Monroe, may I say a few words?" "Of course, Miss Price." Selena stood, her presence graceful yet powerful. She looked directly at Todd, her face serious but not hostile. "I understand being a police officer is a stressful job, and pressure can lead to poor decisions. But mistakes like this can't be ignored. This isn't just about Officer Kessler. It's about the system and whether we allow this to happen again." Todd listened, feeling his heart sink lower with every word. Selena was right. He had believed he always acted with integrity. But now, he could see clearly. His actions had harmed someone because of a bias he had long denied. As he drove home, The city streets blurred past like gray streaks in his peripheral vision, but in Todd Kessler's mind, only one image remained he couldn't shake. The calm, unshaken gaze of Selina Price. A gaze that had unsettled him from the very first moment they met, and now he understood why. She had seen straight through him, had known exactly what was happening before he himself could even grasp it. When he reached home, Todd didn't get out of the car right away. He sat there, frozen, eyes fixed on the steering wheel. The entire day played in his mind like a film on endless loop, and with each replay, the guilt weighed heavier and heavier. He didn't know what would happen next. But one thing he knew for sure: his life had just changed irreversibly. With a deep sigh, he stepped out of the car and walked into his empty house. The silence pressed in from all sides, as if the very air was judging him. He dropped into a chair, his mind spinning with fear, regret, and one question echoing louder than all the restone with no answer. What do I do now? Todd Kessler stood outside the hearing room, heart pounding. The air in the precinct felt different today still, as death, heavy as if the sky itself was being held back. The formal hearing was about to begin, and he knew every word he said today could determine the fate of his 20-year career. He glanced at his reflection in the hallway glass. The man staring back at him looked a decade older than he had just days ago. Sunken eyes, a hollow gaze. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and tried to appear composed even though he wasn't sure he believed in anything anymore. The door opened. Captain Adrienne Monroe appeared, her face devoid of expression. "We're ready, Officer Kessler," she said, her voice even and steely. Todd nodded, swallowed hard, and followed her inside. The room was thick with tension. Along the long table sat stern-faced internal affairs representatives, senior officers, and at the far end, someone Todd had silently hoped not to face again: Selina Price. She sat upright, her gaze locked on him, not hostile, but carrying a silence that felt weightier than words. That look made Todd feel like he was shrinking into his seat. Captain Monroe took the chair at the head of the table and gestured for Todd to sit across from her. He did, his palms already damp with sweat. "Officer Kessler," Monroe began formally, "today's hearing is to assess the appropriateness of your actions during the arrest of Miss Selina Price. We will examine the entire event, how you handled the situation, and the consequences it caused. Do you understand the seriousness of this matter?" "Yes, Captain," Todd answered, his voice low. He glanced briefly toward Selina but quickly turned back to Monroe, as if he couldn't bear to meet her eyes for long. "Good. Let's begin with your report. According to your statement, you believed Miss Price was a suspect in a recent string of thefts. Is that correct?" "Yes. I saw her in the park, and she matched the description we had: black female, somewhere in her 30s or 40s. She seemed suspicious, so I approached her." "Specifically, what made her seem suspicious?" Monroe asked, her voice unwavering. Todd knew this was the pivotal question. "She was sitting alone. When I asked for ID, she didn't present it immediately. I felt she was hiding something." Captain Monroe leaned slightly forward. "And exactly what does 'didn't present it immediately' mean?" "She asked me why I needed it before handing it over," Todd replied, his words awkward in the silence. Selina's voice cut in, sharp, but not aggressive. "I was reading a book, Officer Kessler. Not exactly typical criminal behavior, is it?" Todd bit his lip, trying to maintain composure. "I was just doing my job, Captain. I wanted to ensure public safety." "And did you find anything linking Miss Price to any criminal activity?" Monroe asked, her gaze narrowing. "No, ma'am. She was completely innocent." Silence. The room froze. A representative from Internal Affairs finally spoke, his voice stern. "Officer Kessler, did it ever cross your mind that she might have been telling the truth from the start? That she wasn't the suspect?" Todd swallowed. I was following protocol. We're trained to be cautious, to assume the worst-case scenario until proven otherwise." "And do you think your assumption may have been shaped by something other than protocol?" the official continued, voice cold as steel. Todd went quiet, His heart pounded. "I didn't mean to racially profile," he said softly. "I was just doing my duty." Selina leaned forward, her voice like a slow blade. "Your duty is to protect and serve, not to judge people based on how they look." Todd looked into her eyes and had nothing left to say. Captain Monroe cleared her throat, her gaze stern once again. "Officer Kessler, this hearing is not just about a single incident. It's about a mindset, a system. We need to ensure that every officer here fully understands the value of justice and fairness. This is not just about you. It's about the honor of the entire department." Todd felt his stomach sink. This wasn't just about right and wrong anymore. It was about whether he still deserved to wear the badge. I understand," he murmured. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want." But the words caught in his throat. Captain Monroe's voice softened slightly, but her eyes stayed on him. "Everyone makes mistakes, but how we respond to them, that's what defines us." The room fell quiet. Then Selina rose from her seat. "Captain Monroe, may I speak?" "Go ahead, Miss Price." Selina stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Todd. Her voice was steady, every word weighted with the weight of justice. "I know being a police officer is not easy. The pressure, the danger, and sometimes the stress leads to poor decisions. Those mistakes can't be allowed to repeat. This isn't just about one individual being harmed. This is about an entire community that feels unprotected." She paused, drawing in a breath. "I didn't come here to ruin someone's career, but I did come here to make sure that next time, a woman like me won't be handcuffed just for reading a book in a park." Todd lowered his head for the first time in his life, ashamed of the badge on his chest. Selina continued, her voice steady and resolute. "I didn't come here to destroy anyone's career, but I am here to make sure that next time, when an officer encounters someone like me, they will think twice before acting on bias. This is a chance for change, and I hope this precinct takes it seriously." Captain Adrian Monroe nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Miss Price. Your words have been noted." Selina sat down, her gaze still fixed on Todd. There was no hatred in her eyes, but there was an unwavering firmness, a clear message that she would no longer tolerate injustice in any form. Captain Monroe turned to Todd, her tone softer but still authoritative. "Officer Kessler, you will remain on administrative leave until the investigation concludes. I suggest you use this time to truly reflect on everything that has just occurred. We'll reconvene in the coming days to determine the next step." Todd nodded robotically, his eyes glazed. "Yes, Captain," he whispered. The hearing ended. Officials began leaving the room one by one, but Todd remained seated, his mind spinning. He had entered the hearing hoping to justify his actions. But now, only one thought consumed him: just how wrong he had been. When the last of them had exited, Todd slowly rose to his feet, his body feeling twice its weight. He glanced at Selina one final time. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. There was no animosity, but there was a powerful determination, one that made it clear the truth would not be buried. Todd turned away. He couldn't hold that gaze any longer. Deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. There was still so much he had to face. And as he stepped out of the hearing room, the weight of his actions and their consequences hung over him like a heavy, dark cloud. Captain Adrian Monroe sat in her office, eyes fixed on the stack of reports spread across her desk. Each page was a fragment of the truth she was trying to piece together. The internal investigation into Officer Todd Kessler's conduct was underway, and she knew her responsibility was to dig as deep as necessary, no matter where it led. She massaged her temples gently, feeling the tension mounting on her shoulders. This precinct had long prided itself on upholding a high ethical standard, but the recent incident had shaken that foundation. Whatever the final outcome, Monroe knew the fallout from this would be long-lasting, not just for Todd, but for the entire department. She inhaled slowly, then picked up the first report, the initial witness statements from the park. She had read them multiple times, but each reading added weight to the truth. Every witness, those present when the incident occurred, gave consistent accounts. Todd Kessler had approached Selina Price with the assumption that she was a criminal. No hesitation. No attempt to de-escalate or clarify. Just judgment, intimidation, and bias. Monroe opened the body cam footage from Todd. She had viewed it repeatedly, but each time it made her stomach tighten. Everything in the video was painfully clear. His tone, his posture, his stare, the way he ignored Selena's attempts to explain, and the needless aggression with which he handcuffed a woman who was simply sitting and reading a book. It all pointed to an inescapable truth. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Detective Simone Hall, her deputy investigator, standing in the doorway with a file in hand. "I've got the final batch of witness statements," Simone said, lifting the folder slightly. "And I've scheduled Miss Price to come in this afternoon." "Thank you, Hall," Monroe said, accepting the file. "How's it looking?" Simone sighed, brushing a hand through her graying hair. "Not good, Captain. The witnesses are consistent, and the body cam footage backs every word." Monroe nodded, her expression growing darker. "I figured as much. Should we call Todd back in?" "Yes," she replied, leaning back in her chair. "I want to see if he's ready to face the truth yet." Simone nodded and stepped out, leaving Monroe alone with the weight of the case. She opened the folder and began reading the latest statements. Nothing surprising. Todd had acted aggressively from the start, while Selena had clearly tried to remain calm, tried to explain. But he hadn't listened. As she turned to the final page, Monroe exhaled deeply. She had known Todd for years. He had once been a steady, dedicated officer. But this incident, it had revealed a side of him she'd never seen before. Time moved slowly as Captain Adrian Monroe continued reviewing the evidence. Finally, another knock at the door. Detective Simone Hall entered, followed by Todd Kessler. "Come in, Kessler," Monroe said, keeping her tone neutral. Todd looked exhausted. Dark circles framed his eyes from sleepless nights, and his face was pale with stress. He sat down across from Monroe, glancing at Hall as if searching for something to hold on to. "We're going to go over the entire incident from that day," Monroe said, leaning slightly forward. "I need you to be completely honest. This is your opportunity to tell the story from your side." Todd nodded, though his expression was rigid as stone. "I understand." Monroe nodded and signaled for Hall to begin. "Todd, tell us what was going through your mind when you first saw Miss Selena Price in the park." Todd hesitated, eyes darting as he searched for the right words. I saw someone who closely matched the description of the suspect we were looking for." It was a tense moment. He had to make a decision. "And what made you certain she was the suspect?" Hall asked, her tone sharp. "She matched the description," Todd repeated, his voice beginning to sound defensive. "We were looking for a black female, medium build. She was acting suspicious, like she was hiding something." Monroe could hear the strain in Todd's voice, as if he was clinging to the last scraps of justification. "Todd, the witness statements and your body camera footage paint a very different picture," Monroe said. "They say Miss Price was cooperative, that she tried to explain who she was, but you didn't listen." Todd shifted in his chair, as if an invisible weight was pressing down on him. "She was just trying to distract me. Stall for time. I was just following protocol, Captain." "Protocol?" Monroe repeated, her voice sharp as a blade. "Your training does not include racial profiling, and it doesn't excuse escalating a situation that didn't need to be escalated." Todd started to say something, but Monroe raised a hand to stop him. "Listen, Todd, I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to find the truth, and everything we've gathered so far does not support your version of events. It shows that you acted on biased assumptions, and that those assumptions led to a wrongful arrest." The room went silent for a few seconds. Then Todd spoke, his voice faint. "I didn't want any of this to happen. I was just trying to do my job." Monroe sighed. "I know, but intent doesn't erase the impact of our actions. This isn't just about you. It's about how our department is seen by the people we serve." Before Todd could respond, another knock came at the door. Hall got up to open it, letting Selena Price step inside. She entered with a calm, composed presence. She didn't need authority, her poise alone delivered the message. "Thank you for coming, Miss Price," Monroe said, rising to shake her hand. Selina nodded, her voice gentle. It's my honor, Captain. Monroe gestured for her to sit, then turned to Todd. Todd, we're going to hear from Miss Price now. I want you to listen carefully. Todd nodded, but didn't lift his head to meet Selina's eyes. Monroe gave a nod to Hall to proceed. Miss Price, can you describe the events from your perspective? Selina's voice was steady, firm. I was in the park, enjoying a rare day off. That's when Officer Kessler approached. From the very beginning, he was aggressive, demanded ID, interrogated me like I was a criminal. I tried to explain I was a federal agent, that there had been a mistake, but he wouldn't hear it. He handcuffed me, forced me onto the bench, and treated me like I was a threat. Todd flinched at her words, but he said nothing. His eyes stayed on the table. Hall continued. Do you believe Officer Kessler's actions were influenced by your race? Selina didn't hesitate for even a second. Absolutely. I saw it in his eyes, the way he looked at me. The judgment was already there before I ever said a word. I've experienced it before, but when it comes from someone who's supposed to protect you, it hurts so much more. Monroe looked at Todd, who now sat hunched in his seat, shoulders slumped, his breathing short. Still, he said nothing. Thank you, Miss Price, Monroe said. I appreciate your honesty. Selina nodded and stood up. At the door, she paused and turned to look at Todd. I don't hold personal hatred toward you, Officer Kessler, but I do hope you see this as a chance to change, to understand that your actions carry real consequences, not just in policy, but in people. The way someone is hurt by a bias you didn't even realize you were carrying. With that, she stepped out, leaving behind a heavy silence. Monroe looked at Todd. He was still staring downward, speechless. Kessler, this investigation isn't just about clarifying what happened, Monroe said, her voice low but firm. It's about making sure it never happens again. We have to do better, for the community and for ourselves. Todd nodded slowly. No more justifications, no more grasping at defenses. Only the truth and the raw weight of what he'd done. Take the rest of the day, Todd, Monroe said, her voice softer now. We'll talk again tomorrow. Todd stood, each movement heavy. He said nothing more as he left the office. The door closed behind him. In her office, Captain Monroe let out a deep breath. The investigation had only just begun. But if there was any hope for reform, it would begin here with the truth and the courage to face it. Captain Adrian Monroe sat alone in her office, the final investigation report closed and neatly placed on the desk before her. The conclusion was clear. The decision had been made. But that didn't make the task ahead any easier. She glanced at the clock. Selina Price would be arriving any minute. The conversation they were about to have wasn't just a turning point for Todd Kessler, it was a crossroads for the entire system Monroe was leading. A soft knock at the door. Monroe stood, adjusted the front of her uniform, and drew in a long breath. Come in, she called. The door opened. Selina entered, her gaze as composed and steady as always. She nodded politely at Monroe before taking the seat across from her. Thank you for coming, Price, Monroe began, taking her seat as well. Of course, Captain, Selina replied, voice firm. I assume the investigation is complete? It is, Monroe confirmed, leaning forward slightly. After reviewing all the evidence, the witness statements, the body cam footage, and the interviews, we've decided to terminate Officer Kessler's employment. Selina nodded slowly, receiving the news without surprise. I appreciate the seriousness and thoroughness of the investigation, but I have to ask, do you believe this decision will actually bring change to the department? Monroe paused, choosing her words carefully. I believe it's a step in the right direction. Todd's actions were unacceptable, and terminating him sends a clear message that racial bias and abuse of power will not be tolerated. But I also know that removing one officer won't solve the deeper problem. Selina nodded, her gaze unwavering. You're right. The issue isn't just one person. It's embedded in the internal culture, in how officers are trained, in the unconscious biases quietly steering daily decisions. If we don't address the roots, things like this will keep happening. Monroe nodded, her expression darkening with understanding. I agree completely. This case has made it painfully clear that systemic reform is necessary, and I'm committed to seeing it through. We're reviewing our training programs, expanding content on racial bias awareness, de-escalation techniques, and establishing stronger oversight mechanisms. That's a good start, Selena said, a flicker of approval in her eyes. But real change doesn't come from policy documents. It comes from mindset, from helping officers understand how their actions impact the people they're meant to protect. And that doesn't happen overnight. I know, Monroe said earnestly. The road ahead will be long and difficult. But if we want to restore trust, if we want to ensure what happened to you never happens again, then we don't have a choice. Selena leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful. I've worked in the system long enough to know change is always met with resistance, especially when it exposes uncomfortable truths. But I'm willing to work with you, Captain. Not just for me, but for a system that's fairer and safer for everyone. A sense of deep respect rose in Monroe's chest. Despite everything she had endured, Selena still chose to engage, to build, not to tear down, still chose dialogue over hate, still chose progress. I deeply appreciate that, Price, Monroe said, her tone softening but firm. Your experience and perspective will be invaluable, and I want you to know your voice will be heard. I'm not looking for special treatment, Selena said openly. I just want to be sure this department becomes the best version of itself. That's what the community deserves. And that's what the officers deserve too. You're right. And I give you my word, we'll work toward that. The room fell quiet for a moment. The two women, each a representative of opposite ends of the system, sat in that silence, letting the weight of the conversation settle. Firing Todd Kessler was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead in policies, in dialogues, in transforming the internal culture. That was what would truly prevent injustice from repeating. Selena stood. Monroe followed, extending her hand. Thank you again, Price. I look forward to working with you. Selena shook her hand firmly. Likewise, Captain. Let's make this a turning point for real changement, just a temporary reaction. And with that, Selena left the office, leaving Monroe alone with her thoughts. She glanced at the final report one last time, then closed it with purpose. The decision was made. But now, all eyes would be watching to see if she and her department would truly act. She knew the path ahead would be difficult. There would be pushback. There would be friction. But Monroe was ready. Because this wasn't just about one officer. It wasn't just about a single mistake. It was about justice, about dignity, and about doing what's right, no matter how hard that might be. The morning was overcast, gray clouds blanketing the sky as Selena Price climbed the steps of the police precinct. The air felt heavy, like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, but no longer panicked. Instead, a new energy was quietly spreading. The changes Captain Monroe had promised were beginning to take shape, even though everyone knew the road ahead was long. Selena entered the building and immediately noticed the small but meaningful signs. A new bulletin board near the entrance displayed information about training sessions on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. Officers moving through the halls seemed quieter, more contemplative. The events of the past few weeks had left a permanent mark. On her way to Captain Monroe's office, Selena nodded politely to those she passed. Some returned the gesture with respectful eyes. Others avoided her gaze. They were still grappling with the aftermath. The office door was slightly ajar. Selena knocked softly before pushing it open. "Come in," Monroe said, looking up from a stack of files. Selena stepped in and closed the door behind her. Captain Monroe stood and greeted her with a rare smile, warm, genuine. "Good to see you again, Price." "Likewise, Captain," Selena replied, taking a seat. "I wanted to check in. How are things progressing?" Monroe nodded, her face serious but filled with quiet determination. "We're making progress. The new training program has been launched, and we've implemented a stronger internal oversight system. It's just the beginning, but we're moving in the right direction. Selina nodded, her gaze sharp but gentle. Change takes time, but it's encouraging to see you following through. How are the officers responding? Mixed reactions, Monroe admitted. Not everyone is eager, but most understand that this is necessary. We've had some tough conversations, but I believe we're starting to shift. Selina leaned forward slightly, her voice firm. The most important thing is to keep the momentum going. Don't let it become a short-term response to a single incident. Make it a foundation. That's the goal, Monroe said. We want to rebuild from the roots a culture that runs on fairness and respect for everyone we serve. Just then, the office door opened again. Todd Kessler entered, holding a cardboard box with his personal belongings. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow from lack of sleep. He was there to collect the last of his things one final time. Captain, he greeted softly, avoiding Selina's gaze. Kessler, Monroe responded, her tone neutral. The room fell silent, heavy with all that remained unsaid. Finally, Todd looked at Selina, his face tight. Miss Price, I just wanted to say I never meant for any of this to happen. Selina met his gaze with calm resolve. It's not about what you meant, Officer Kessler. It's about what you did, and the consequences of those actions. Intent doesn't erase impact. Todd flinched slightly at the bluntness, but he nodded. I know. I don't know how to make it right. Start by facing the truth, Selina said evenly. We all have biases, but what matters is how we confront them. You have a chance to learn from this to become a better person. Todd's shoulders sagged. The weight of it all showed in every movement. He turned back to Monroe, his voice raspy. I guess this is the end. Monroe looked at him, her tone softer now. It doesn't have to be the end, Todd. You can still choose to grow, to change. But that choice is yours. Todd stood still for a long moment, as if absorbing it deeply. Then he nodded. I'll think about it. He paused before turning away. Good luck, Captain. And you too, Price. He walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft click like a period marking the end of a painful chapter. Monroe and Selina sat in silence, watching him go. Do you think he'll be all right? Selina asked after a moment. Monroe exhaled, leaning back in her chair. I hope so. But that's not in our hands anymore. What we can do now is focus on what needs to be done. Selina nodded. And there's still a lot to do. They sat for a moment longer, quietly reflecting on everything that had happened. Finally, Selina stood and extended her hand. Thank you for everything, Captain. I truly respect your commitment to justice. Monroe took her hand and gave it a firm shake. Thank you, Price. Your presence and persistence have been irreplaceable. We're on the same side. Selina nodded, then stepped out of the office, walking down the now familiar halls. Each step was confident, no longer an outsider, but someone helping pave the way for something better. Along the hallway, officers watched her with a variety of expressions: respect, uncertainty, reflection. She didn't expect change overnight, but she knew it had begun. What had happened over the past few weeks had opened a new door, and now it was time for everyone to walk through it. Outside, the morning air was still brisk. Selina took a deep breath, feeling a quiet determination stir in her chest. The road ahead was long. There was much more work to do. But she was ready, because change was coming, and she would be a part of it, one step at a time.